a child prodigy who admitted he grew up in fear of his own father. The most famous artist on the planet, obsessed with changing his own face, while the world debated whether he had also changed the color of his skin. A global icon whose relationship with minors became one of the biggest controversies of his life, and ultimately led him to face a trial that shocked the world. A father who held his child out in the air from a fifth-floor balcony in front of dozens of cameras and raised serious questions about his ability to protect him. A man who built an amusement park in his own home to relive the childhood he never had, and who died under the effects of a powerful anesthetic administered by his own doctor. A man who didn't even need to sing to make thousands of people collapse, but also a man surrounded by contradictions, by suspicion, by questions that were never fully answered. For years, the world saw Michael Jackson as an absolute genius, the greatest artist of his generation. But behind the spectacle, there was another story, a story of control, obsession, and transformation, and of a question that still feels uncomfortable. How can someone be, at the same time, the most beloved artist on the planet and one of the most controversial figures in history? This is not just the story of Michael Jackson. It's the story of what happens when fame comes before identity. Michael Jackson was born in 1958 in Indiana, United States, an industrial city, tough, shaped by work and discipline. But inside his home, the pressure was even greater. His father, Joe Jackson, was not just a father. He was a coach and an extremely strict manager. A man obsessed with success, with perfection, with not failing. Michael grew up in an environment where making mistakes was not an option. Constant rehearsals, endless repetitions, harsh corrections. While other kids were playing, he was rehearsing. While others were discovering who they were, he was learning to become what others expected him to be. That's how the Jackson 5 were born, and that's how the future phenomenon began to take shape. Michael had something different, a presence impossible to ignore, a voice that didn't sound like a child's, a connection with the audience that couldn't be explained. But behind that talent, there was something else. There was pressure, there was fear, and a childhood that never truly existed. And that void didn't fade away. It only grew over time. But before we continue, there are 3 details that help explain Michael Jackson's relationship with his own image. 1. The white glove, one of the most iconic elements of his career, was not just an aesthetic choice, it was a way to hide. Michael began wearing it to cover the first visible signs of vitiligo on his hands. What the public saw as style was also protection. 2. The moonwalk, the move that turned him into a legend, was not invented by him, but it was redefined. Michael understood something better than anyone. It wasn't about creating from scratch, it was about transforming and owning the impact. 3. Total control. From his movements, to his wardrobe, to his public image, nothing was left to chance, because for Michael Jackson, it wasn't just about being an artist, it was about being perfect. And when perfection becomes an obsession, the cost always shows up. In the early 1980s, Michael Jackson stopped being a promise and became something much bigger. He became a global phenomenon. Thriller arrives, and with it comes a level of success the industry had never seen before. It wasn't just music, it was spectacle. It was image. It was cultural impact. Every music video felt like a movie, every appearance an event, and then something happens that changes everything. Motown 25, year 1983. Michael Jackson takes a step back and seems to glide across the floor. The world stops. The moonwalk instantly becomes iconic and puts him at the center of global attention, even though he didn't invent it. He turned it into a symbol because that's what Michael did. He didn't create from scratch, but he turned everything he touched into something unforgettable. And that wasn't all. to achieve one of his most impossible moves, the famous lean-in smooth criminal. He had special shoes designed and patented that allowed him to defy gravity, live on stage. Nothing was improvised. Everything was planned. Everything was controlled. But as his figure kept growing, something else began to change. His appearance, and then his face, his skin, his image, began to look different. The world started noticing changes, asking questions, building theories. For years, people talked about aesthetic choices, about obsession, about voluntary transformation, until in 1993, something different was confirmed. Michael Jackson had vitiligo, a disease that destroys skin pigmentation and largely explained the gradual change in his appearance. But by that point, the narrative was already set, and the doubt was there too. But before we continue, there are 3 things that help explain who Michael was, even as a child. 1. Michael Jackson admitted he was afraid of his own father. It wasn't respect. It was real fear. A fear that stayed with him for years, even into adulthood, with stories of abuse and mistreatment coming to light. 2. From a very young age, Michael didn't see music as a game. He saw it as an obligation. It wasn't a hobby. It was his job, his responsibility, and his only form of validation. 3. While the world was beginning to see him as a star, he was already starting to feel different, isolated, separated from everyone else, as if he never truly fit in. And when childhood isn't lived, it doesn't disappear. And many times, it comes back later. As his success kept growing, Michael Jackson began to drift away from the world, not just from the public, but from reality itself. He buys a property in California and turns it into something unique, Neverland Ranch, a private amusement park with rides, with a zoo, with a movie theater, with everything a child could ever dream of. But Michael was no longer a child. He was the most famous artist on the planet. And even so, he chose to surround himself with that world. Neverland was not just a house, it was an idea, an attempt to recover something he never had, a childhood. Michael invited children to spend time there, to play, to stay overnight. For him, it was about sharing. It was companionship. It was innocence. But for the world, it began to look different. Strange, unsettling, hard to explain. And then, the first major turning point arrives. In 1993, for the first time, Michael Jackson's name becomes associated with something completely different. An accusation, a minor, accuses him of abuse. The impact is immediate. The story spreads around the world. The media explodes. His image begins to crack. Michael denies everything, but the pressure is enormous. He cancels his tour. He speaks about exhaustion. He speaks about dependence on painkillers, and eventually, the case never goes to trial. It is settled out of court, a multi-million-dollar agreement, with no admission of guilt, but with a consequence that couldn't be avoided. The doubt remains. Pause. For the first time, the king of pop was no longer just admired. Now, he was also questioned. But before we continue, there are 3 moments that ultimately changed how the world saw Michael Jackson. 1. The interview with Oprah. For the first time, Michael speaks openly about his childhood, about fear, about pain, about abuse. The world sees something different, not just a star. 2. The documentary Living with Michael Jackson. Year 2003. Michael appears on camera, speaking naturally about his relationship with children, even admitting to sharing the same room. For him, it was something innocent. For the public, it was a point of no return. 3. The shift in the narrative. From that moment on, there was no longer just one story about Michael Jackson. There were 2, the genius and the suspect. And from then on, neither of them ever disappeared. After the documentary, the situation escalates. Year 2005. Michael Jackson is once again at the center of everything. But this time, there is no settlement. There is a trial. He is accused in the case of Gavin Arvizo, a minor who claims to have been a victim of abuse. For months, the entire world watches. Cameras, journalists, fans, critics, everyone waiting for an answer. Michael arrives in court as a completely different figure. More fragile, more isolated, more questioned. The defense denies everything. The prosecution insists. The trial exposes every detail of his life, his privacy, his habits, his relationships with minors. Nothing is left out. Until finally, the verdict arrives. Michael Jackson is acquitted of all charges, legally innocent. But in the public eye, the story was already different, because even though justice had spoken, the doubt would remain there forever. After the trial, Michael is never the same again. He withdraws. He appears less. He seems different. Neverland is left behind. The image of the king of pop begins to fade. But there is something else. Financial problems. Despite having generated hundreds of millions, Michael accumulates debt. He mortgages his catalog. He loses control over part of his empire. And then, one last opportunity appears. This is it. A series of concerts scheduled to take place in London. His big comeback, the perfect farewell. Tickets sell out in minutes, the world once again watching him closely. But that comeback never happens. On June 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson dies at the age of 50, just weeks before the first show. The cause, acute intoxication from propofol, a powerful anesthetic, administered by his personal physician. The most famous man on the planet dies in a private room in silence. Far from the stage, his doctor is convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and the world comes to a standstill. After his death, Michael Jackson's image does not fade. It multiplies. Record-breaking sales, tributes, documentaries, but also, the questions return. Years later, the documentary Leaving Neverland brings everything back. New accusations, new testimonies, and once again, a divided world. For some, Michael Jackson is the greatest artist of all time. For others, a figure impossible to separate from controversy. And maybe, both things will coexist forever, because his story was never simple. It was brilliant, uncomfortable, and deeply contradictory. Michael Jackson was not just an artist, he was a one-of-a-kind phenomenon, a child turned into an idol, before he even understood who he was, an adult trying to rebuild what he never had. The world saw his talent, celebrated his music, and copied his moves, but it also watched him fall, judged him, and never stopped asking who he really was, because very often, the greatest success can also become the greatest pressure. This was Behind the Icon, and this was the story of Michael Jackson. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which story you'd like us to tell next.